Welcome to C2GTalk, a series of one-on-one interviews with influential practitioners and thought leaders to explore the governance challenges raised by emerging approaches to alter the climate. I am Mark Turner, Senior Communications Consultant with C2G, and I'm speaking today with Ronny Jumeau, whose career includes being a cabinet minister and ambassador for the Republic of Seychelles, as well as the C2GTalk roving ambassador for the ocean and climate change. Ambassador Jumeau was a member of the Seychelles delegation to the UN's climate change conferences from 2007 to 2021 and represented small island developing states on the Green Climate Fund board. He's also a member of the board of the Directors of Island Conservation, an international NGO based in California, and was a member of C2G's advisory group during the first 3 years of our existence. Ronny Jumeau, welcome to C2GTalk.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Brilliant. And just to be clear, you're speaking in your personal capacity these days. There's no.
Yes. And now I'm now talking as an independent consultant in the fields that I specialize in, having retired from government service.
Great. Well, let's start with the challenge. What are the current and future expected impacts of climate change facing the Seychelles, and as well as small island states in general? And how much do you see this increasing over the coming decades?
Well, climate change is very much, for Seychelles as much as for small island developing states and ocean states around the world, is very much a present danger. Seychelles, for example, like many SIDS, small island developing states, the SIDS, the economy depends heavily on tourism, and already tourism and secondly on fisheries, and both of them depend on nature and the effects of climate change on nature. One of the big problems we're already facing in Seychelles is coastal erosion, also sea level rise, but other problems associated, both of which affect tourism. We have mainly a marine-based tourism and fisheries. We also have the problem of rising sea temperatures, which is affecting not only killing coral reefs, but affecting the habits, the migration habits of fish. If our fish migrate, then we will be in trouble. We have water security problems, changes in rainfall, in droughts. Our droughts are getting longer. Our rainy periods are getting shorter and more intense, which leads to storms and flooding. Practically everything you can think of is already happening on islands. I'd like to correct a misconception people here have about small islands, especially small islands. They have, when you look at emojis of small islands, it's a mound of sand with a coconut tree in the middle. The thing is, many islands, even islands which are not low-lying, obviously if you're low-lying like the Maldives in the Indian Ocean, like Tuvalu, like the Marshall Islands, like Kiribati in the Pacific, one of your biggest long-term problems is sleeping below the waves. Seychelles is more like the Fijian Islands and others, and coral and volcanic islands, in that we have mountains. However, our entire economy depends on the ocean. Secondly, 80% of our population, 80% of our economic activity is on the coast, which is very low-lying. So many SIDS face the possibility of becoming economically unviable before they are covered by the ocean. So it's not a question of, how long will it take before the oceans rise above your beaches and we've got that amount of time to save you. No, you don't. If we lose the fish, we're a tuna fishing, industrial fishing country. If the tuna moves, and it will, with rising sea temperatures, if the beaches go, and with the coral reefs dying, that allows stronger waves to hit the beaches and take away the sand, which people come for, the famous sand. If they go, then we have nothing to survive on. So we will have islands to live on, but economically we could become a failed state. And that
what sort of timeframes are we looking at?
Well, generally people are saying before the end of the century, but the interesting thing about timeframes is that climate change is always ahead of the science. The science is always struggling to catch up. Whenever they say, okay, it's going to take the Greenland ice shelf so long to melt, the glaciers around the world to melt, the West Antarctic ice shelf to melt, And then they always discover things are melting faster than they thought. So we are always struggling to keep up. For example, we have built artificial islands. One of the things we've done, because we've been not so much for climate change, is because the narrow coastal strip that we build on is more or less full. And behind it is our steep mountains with very forested, which are our water towers. But so we built as an adaptation measure, we built artificial islands. And when we built the artificial islands, because Seychelles at the time was a middle income country, we are now a high income country, we had to borrow. And we built the islands above projected sea level rise, only to find out down the road, when you're still playing the loan, that the scientists have raised the projected sea level rise. And that actually, if you go to those islands now and you see the high water mark, it doesn't leave much before the water overtops the island. And these are the complexities that we in islands face, in that the scale of the problems as they get worse are getting so expensive that even Seychelles, as a high income country, cannot afford to pay for what needs to be done.
So what other kind of level, I mean, you mentioned one form of adaptation, what other kind of forms of adaptation might be possible? And at what point does, essentially global temperature rise become so high that it's prohibitively expensive to do so?
So Seychelles is one of the leading countries, for example, in coral rehabilitation. Not only do several islands now have coral farms or coral nurseries, both outside of the water and ex situ and in situ, but what's interesting in Seychelles, because the beaches are so important to the hotels, and the reefs, the offshore reefs protect the beach. What is happening now, we've been quite good at, is getting five-star hotels to team up with NGOs to grow corals. But the problem is, you can only grow corals depending on how high the temperature of the water goes. There will be corals that are adaptive, that are resilient. We've identified them. We're growing them. What people don't understand is different coral reefs have a different ecosystem, different types of fish and species. Yeah. So when you replace, it's like replacing a natural forest with a planted forest. Now everything changes. On the beaches, unfortunately, we are granitic, the main islands where the tourists are. We have used rock armoring, granite rocks, instead of seawalls. We prefer slanted granite rocks, which mimic the motion of water going up a beach. And it's a bit of an eyesore, but it's one way of protecting, because the sand then gets trapped in the rocks. It's better than seawalls. We are trying, for example, for the water security, we receive about 3 times more tourists than our population. That's how much water we have to use. That's how much more imports we have to bring in. And because of the water security, when we don't have enough storage capacity for rainfall, we have had to switch, for example, a very expensive form of adaptation to desalination. And in trying to solve a water problem, the desalination plants so far are fueled by fossil fuels. So you increase your use of fossil fuels, you increase your emissions, which is one climate change problem, to try and solve another, which is growing water insecurity. We're also doing a lot of, one important thing which maybe I can talk about later is we're also now trying to be a world leader in nature-based solutions, which are both a mitigation and adaptation measure, especially seagrasses and mangroves, which I can talk about later.
Absolutely, we'll definitely touch on that in a bit. I just wanted to take a little step back. You've obviously spoken about the ocean experience as affects the Seychelles, but more broadly, how are you seeing issues surrounding climate and the ocean being addressed in climate policy, diplomacy? Is sufficient attention, is sufficient mechanisms being given to it?
Well, in recent years, ocean has risen to the top of the agenda, but not necessarily for the right reasons. We have the looming specter of deep sea mining, which has to be solved. I am aware in my talking to different countries in Africa and in Indian Ocean that some countries have taken an interest in the ocean because of what the wealth it may contain, not just fisheries, but mineral wealth, The minerals you will need, for example, for the transition to renewable energy, although there's work now to replace these with other resources, and increasing petroleum, oil and gas, despite the need to phase out fossil fuels.
Yeah.
There is in the developing world more of a push to take fossil fuels out of the ground rather than keep them there because of the development challenges they have. For example, let's take within the island states, the small island developing states. We have fossil fuel producers in the small island states. Now, if you have an island which depends on tourism and fisheries, and tourism, you have a carrying capacity, Seychelles has one, we're probably reaching it, where you can't take any more tourists, and your fisheries is collapsing, no one is helping you out, and you find fossil fuels. What do you do? These are other dilemmas that a small islands and decisions small islands have to take. But oceans are have come to the fore. Ocean climate action, which Seychelles specializes in, is becoming better understood. But unfortunately, until we clear up the future of whether we're going to go ahead with deep sea mining or not, I mean, I'm obviously against it. The government of Seychelles is sitting on the fence for the time being because it has to weigh all its options. I don't have to run the country and help run the country anymore. But it's amazing how ocean has risen to the top of the agenda. We've had quite a number of successes. We've had the BBNJ, the agreement to protect biodiversity beyond a national jurisdiction in the high seas. We've had decisions on doing away with fishery subsidies. There are so many gains so far, but the governance is not sufficiently in place yet to handle these.
So I wondered if I could switch tack a little bit into sort of the bigger field of climate diplomacy and COPs and the COP
Yes.
process. There's a lot of focus this year
Yeah.
for various reasons on the UAE COP, global stocktake. Every year everyone says this is the most important COP ever, but there's a feeling that this is a pretty important COP, let's put it that way. You've been attending these conferences for many years now. Over time, well, maybe we'll start with how have you seen them evolve over the time that you've been doing this, and to what extent have they become more or less fit for purpose?
The sad thing is COPs have gotten, as you said, every year they say it's an important COP, and the reason is because we failed to take action. We should have taken action a long time ago. And I'm proud to say that the small island developing states were amongst the first to sound the alarm in, I think, 1980s. No one listened. And at that time, it was easier to make a distinction to who is vulnerable, who is more vulnerable. Now everyone is vulnerable. This is why loss and damage took so long to get recognized until last year in COP27, until everybody now is suffering loss and damage. So we wait to get to the brink before we take action. And this is one of the reasons everyone says each COP is more important, is because each COP fails to deliver as much as it should. Sometimes we celebrate gains that are really pathetic, but it's better than nothing. That's the attitude we're taking. We're following the bottom line. But on the other hand, where would we go if we don't go to the COP? We're very worried, especially small countries, the smaller countries. We can't allow G7, G20, or even now we're seeing BRICS is trying is discussing about enlarging the BRICS group, the British, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. What we know is with the BRICS, which is a developing world group, is where will they stand vis-a-vis G77 and China, which includes all the small islands. And for us, whether it's G20, whether it's G7, whether it's the BRICS, small islands like Seychelles, we're still left out in the cold. We're still elbowed off the table. The only place where we can speak and no one can shut us up or say you can't come here is the UN. The UN is the only thing we have. It's the only place every independent sovereign country in the world has a voice, and you can't stop them speaking, although there are attempts to do it. I've been in meeting COPs where the gavel went down very quickly to stop someone from saying something that the rest of us didn't like. But it's the only place we can go and speak, and at the same time, not just speak out. It's the only place where we can gather as a group. The states, the small island developing states, we gather as AOSIS, the Alliance of Small Island States. And when the biggest gathering of negotiators from small island states are the COPs.
So at COPs, obviously, often the speeches or the interventions by from small island states representatives are some of the most, passionate and important emotionally, in the sense of grounding what it is we're talking about. At the same time, though, to what extent do you feel you're able to influence the actual outcomes of the COPs as a small island state group?
Well, if you go over the history of the COPs, look at some from the Kyoto Protocol on some of the biggest achievements, including loss and damage, they actually were put on the table by the COP, by the states. We have a history, an experience of first being ignored, and then laughed at, and then as what we say comes true, everybody scurries over to curry favor with us. Let us look at one of the biggest gains of COP27 was loss and damage fund, right? The SIDS raised loss and damage more than 30 years ago. We were the first. It took 30 years to accept. Can you imagine what climate change has done in that past 30 years? And even when it was accepted at COP27, it was because of some maneuverings, and the Europeans abandoned the group who were resisting loss and damage, left the Americans out on their own in the cold, and the Americans, all embarrassed, joined the group. But they made sure we had a fund that's still a shell.
Now, of course, the question is, will money go into that fund? So what are you expecting from COP28 in sort of briefly? What do you think the big focus should be?
One is operationalizing the loss and damage fund, obviously. However, people who are not really know the process very much would say, I don't think you're going to have a fund operationalized when they haven't even delivered the rich countries on the $100 billion they promised us in Copenhagen by 2020. And even if they did finally reach the 100 billion and put some money in the loss and damage fund, and we're asking for the doubling of the funds to the adaptation fund, even they put in, according to the research that's been done, the needs are in the trillions. We need to move from billions to trillions. And we keep being told, oh, there isn't enough public money for that. We understand. We're having problems raising money from private sector. Some of us, like Seychelles, have raised money from philanthropic. But one of the blessings of COVID-19 and Ukrainian war has shown the world that money can be mobilized pretty quickly when they want to. It's a question of priorities. In COVID-19, not only did they mobilize the money, but the rich countries went and bought more vaccines that they needed for their own population. And up to today, most of Africa still isn't vaccinated. So they can source the money. The money is there.
So raise the money. And what about fossil fuel phase out? There's some debate.
Definitely.
Will that happen
There's
this
fossil
year?
fuels. What we would like is coal at least by 2030 at the latest.
Right.
And fossil fuel subsidies as quickly as you can. If you could do it tomorrow, we would like that. And the next discussion is other fossil fuels. After all, the presidency of this year's COP is a major oil and gas country.
So let's talk about 1.5, this figure. Previous COPs have talked about this, keep 1.5 alive, 1.5 to stay alive, these catchphrases, and yet there was quite a lot of attention when the WMO recently this year said there was a 2/3 chance that this would be breached in the next 5 years, at least temporarily. It's always been a sense you go over and come down again, although will we? I don't know. But to what extent is 1.5 degrees still a useful objective that should be kind of central to policy and
Well,
think.
if you look on either side of 1.5, we can't say we now need 1 degree, right? 2 degrees is too dangerous, right? At 2 degrees, all the coral reefs die. At 1.5, about 70%. At 2 degrees, some 90% of coral reefs. So if we say, well, we'll go for 2 degrees, you might as well wipe the SIDS off the map. You might as well wipe coastal countries, river delta countries off the map. 2 degrees is just not acceptable. So we're stuck with 1.5 and trying to find the different ways, innovative ways of addressing the problem. As far as the science is concerned, the reports have come out from IPCC. You can't think of one. Several years ago, people said maybe one degree should be a new 1.5, but forget it. We're hanging on by our fingernails to 1.5, and people say we still have what we need, the money and the resources and the science we need to reach 1.5. It's the political will that's missing. It's not the technology and the resources. And 2 degrees is just, and incidentally, one thing I tell people when they talk about sea level rise is a small island problem. I say, no, because if we reach a stage of sea level rise where the islands disappear, so will Miami, so will New York, so will all the great cities that are built. The only difference between us and them is that they have money and they will throw concrete at it, increasing the carbon emissions from the cement industry. That's the difference, because they're all more or less on the same level as us. I used an example in Africa. Someone said, oh, our African islands, you're facing this problem. I said, what will happen in the Nile Delta will make you forget we even exist.
Yes,
Because I mean, just that one. And Europe doesn't want it to happen in Nile Delta because what's happening about people crossing the Mediterranean, the migrants, it'll look like a picnic now compared to what happens if just the Nile Delta went under. And it is sinking because aquifers and etc.
So back to some 1.5 and what keeps us there. Obviously, stopping emissions is going to be a big part of it, but there's also other approaches, supplementary additional approaches. If you're going to bring it back down the temperature, carbon dioxide removal has been stated as one of the key things you need to do. But both, reaching net zero to compensate for hard to abate emissions, but also effectively to clean up CO2 pollution from the atmosphere. At the same time, and there's been a lot of focus recently on carbon dioxide removal and more money in it. At the same time, a lot of concern that putting too much emphasis on this, given all the challenges around it, scale up and cost and so forth, could undermine the work of stopping fossil fuel emissions, the moral hazard problem, or the various words for that. So what are your thoughts generally on this debate? And also, you mentioned earlier, nature-based solutions. What are your general instincts about the two broad, although you can't separate them that cleanly, but the two broad approaches, biological or technological approach to carbon dioxide removal?
Okay, and one thing we're going to see at COP28 is a lot on CCS, carbon capture and storage. The oil producers are big on that. As an islander, and based on, and not just as a small island, but even more importantly on this subject, as a large ocean state, I would point to the fact that the biggest carbon sink in the world is nature. I'm not saying we're not going to need all the other different technologies that are being needed, either to take carbon out of the atmosphere or to reflect solar radiation back into space. I'm not saying that. Before we do that, with all its complexities, why don't we repair the damage we've done to nature? And this is where nature-based solutions come in. In Seychelles, we have 115 islands, about 455 square kilometers of land. 47% of that is protected, but it's nothing. 47% of 455 square kilometers. We have 1.35 million square kilometers of ocean. And right now we're using, with the help of people like Oxford University, Necton Mission, Pew Trust, a lot of friends, our partnerships are very important in this. We are now surveying our mangroves and our seagrass beds to see how much. We will probably find out that our mangroves and seagrass beds sequester more carbon than we emit. Right? We'll probably find that out, because just the mangroves on Aldabra Atoll, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, which is our largest expanse of mangroves, now store the equivalent of a certain percentage of the whole emissions of Seychelles. And if we could do that with the oceans coming forward, there are so many co-benefits in doing that. And this is why it's interesting. For you to sequester carbon in the seafloor or in the forest, you need to protect them. You must not think of nature as just as a carbon sink. It's about the other crisis we have, the biodiversity crisis. If you make that argument, then the people involved in the biodiversity process, the biodiversity sector, have a reason to push for climate action. And the people in climate action have a reason to push for protection of biodiversity. So we all become conservationists, environmental biodiversity conservationists, and everybody becomes a climate activist. Plus the SDGs, it's livelihoods, it's food security, it's hunger, it's when you go through many of the SDGs, saving nature. So at the same time, instead of putting on a narrow prism of the climate COPs, which is one of the failings of the COPs,
right,
is that had we taken that approach a long time ago, maybe we'd be much further down the road, especially in using Mother Earth herself as the biggest sink.
Is this a commercial opportunity for Seychelles to essentially sell carbon credits from, mangrove restoration and so forth?
This is the idea, but we'd have to work on carbon credits. There's been a lot of work concerned by now as to certain of the carbon markets now are not really viable, they're not really credible. We would have to work on that. But the idea would be, we were hoping that there would be blue carbon, there would be a blue carbon market as well. And it is one way of raising funds, because by raising funds on the carbon market to protect nature, we're actually strengthening our tourism sector. Because that's why people come to Seychelles. And we're protecting our fishery sector, because some of the work they're going to do is going to protect, hopefully, fish stocks.
So while clearly all these co-benefits are, essential, this feeds human well-being and sustainability in many ways, there is a danger of relying too much on nature, thinking that nature can do too much of the job. Do you think, and we've seen a lot of back and forth recently, I mean, particularly over afforestation. So yeah. Someone says afforestation is the answer, then there's a lot of pushback, and we're seeing a lot of debate over standards and so forth now. Are we seeing that in blue carbon as well?
Blue carbon is not that well developed. I think one of the advantages of that is we learn from what's happened so far as we form a blue carbon market. And it's true, because according to the scientists, nature can take care of only about over 30%, 38% of emissions up to 2030. So there is a limit. And as you said, there's also, whilst taking care of nature can help with food security, can also affect production of food, as we've seen, for example, with renewable energy, bioenergy, and that sort of thing, and replacing forests with plantation forests, etc. There's a lot of complexities. But what I'm saying is, if we go into scientific technological engineering to engineer climate change, you shut us out. Why don't you make sure, when I mean you, the climate process, one of the best ways of tackling climate change is not to divide us into different groups who can do what, is to say, what is it that we can all do? One thing islands can do is nature. Bring us in, because we'll be coming in not just to save ourselves, because the nature will help save us, but in doing that, we feel we are part of the solution. We feel that we have a finger in it. When you start reflecting things back into space, we're out of the top. We hope to have a say in the governance. We hope, but we're not going to have a say in the technology.
Well, let's go on to that. So you are talking about this sort of broad idea of solar radiation modification, where you'd reflect a small portion of incoming sunlight to lower temperatures. So the one that gets the most attention in some ways is the idea of stratospheric aerosol injection, which would in some ways mimic the effect of volcanoes. So goes the idea, by reflecting, by putting aerosols in the stratosphere. But there are other approaches as well. And Australia, for example, has been exploring whether it can help protect its corals through marine cloud brightening, I guess both as a local adaptation mechanism, but also has this idea of SRM. I mean, in general, and we are seeing increasingly people from island states involved in the research of these technologies. And that could be seen as part of governance, but they're actually getting into the science. So I'm just sort of interested, let's take research first. Do you support the idea of researching these technologies, and where should that research take place?
What I'm worried about is a certain amount of tokenism. Let's put an island in the submarine, right? When maybe our efforts would be better used going into other areas where people will say, instead of taking people out of the relatively few negotiators we have in terms of what other countries have, why don't we strengthen these areas? Because right now, for example, we did a debt swap to protect 30% of our ocean. And one of the best things out of the trust fund that came out of the debt swap is never before in the history of Seychelles has there been so much marine research by Seychelles. And the last time I checked, out of 7 researchers who got grants from the debt swap, out of 9 researchers, 7 were women. So it's a gender story, it's a youth story, and it's fascinating. But the fact remains is we wouldn't be able to do it without deep-pocketed partners, right? And the more we go into solutions that demand more complicated technology, when we can't handle what we have already, you can't stop a young person coming out with A-levels wanting to go to university, and if they have the funding, they can raise the funding on themselves. That's what they're going to study. You can't stop that. But this is which worries me as an islander, is where are our resources best placed? And if you're going to go up into the stratosphere, the atmosphere, and start spreading things around, it's highly unlikely there's going to be an islander up there. We get very nervous. We get even more nervous when you start talking about putting things in the ocean. Because then we're talking of ocean currents, which are changing because of climate change and warming oceans. We get even more nervous about that. When we know that we don't have enough know-how, we don't have enough capacity to deal with the challenges we have now.
But there will, this is a question though, with regards to governance, I hear you exactly what you're saying, but at the same time, we've already seen a startup in the US, whether it was real or a stunt or who knows how to describe it, but essentially starting what they claimed to be some form of deployment in Mexico. And, this created a big backlash, and now there are efforts to govern it. It may be that the question is, you may not choose to want to do governance as a priority, but it may be necessary anyway. And given the need for that governance, how do you actually get effective, meaningful governance from experts in small island states, the Seychelles, wherever?
We obviously have to be at the table, right? And to go back to something I said earlier, the history of COPs has shown that islanders are innovative, if anything else. Many of these things that have come up, it came from us. So we have to be at the table, but we have to be careful that it doesn't become a distraction. We have to be careful that when you're asking for money for loss and damage and adaptation and mitigation, that people suddenly are diverting money into these startups that take up huge amounts of money for little, what we can see, results so far. This is where the worry is, in that, for example, let's take the US, for example, in addressing their climate goals. One of the things they're doing is a lot of government money is going into renewables. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. if it's going to help them suck up, but what is it doing? It's taking money. It's reducing the amount of money they could be giving to people like us, because it's government money. Unless, of course, you get private sector and philanthropic is there's money there, impact investing, but it's a limited amount of money. That's the worry we have. In that it's like when your billionaires going into space. That discussion is it's their money. Someone needs to go into space, but is it well spent? Could we be doing something that benefits more people than making them look good? And it's the whole thing about when you look at these startups, and I see these pictures of these machines sucking carbon dioxide out of the air, when I'd like to see in my country more trees sucking carbon dioxide out of the air and more seagrass being planted. And it's for us, those are very, very expensive solutions, let alone having that. So that there are people out there looking into these possible solutions, that there are people like the C2G who are looking at the issue of governance, how do we govern that? And maybe what happened with BB&J gives hope.
Yes.
Yeah, the conservation of biodiversity in the high seas.
Yeah.
Although I'd like to see how we're going to you watch, the devil is in the details. When we're going to try and protect high seas, there's going to be a problem. But maybe not too long ago, people wouldn't have believed, because of the history of the law of the sea, which was a very difficult agreement to reach. People would have said, no, we're not going to, because there were a lot of commercial interests there who didn't want regulation of the high seas for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
But we got an agreement.
So let me just sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I wonder if I could just sort of start to wrap this up. I wanted just to ask you this because I've noticed you're a fairly keen social media user in the past. Of course, there's been a bit of interest recently in the degree to which various platforms are actually hostile, becoming more hostile for climate discussions and so forth. How do you feel? To what extent do you still see social media as a useful tool in talking about climate justice, climate action? How are you seeing it evolve?
Okay, I think it's the best way to reach the youth, right? When I was back in the days when I was an environment minister, for example, and we protected sea turtles, and we have culturally and traditionally eaten sea turtles, and I used to say, my generation, we have strict laws, but people is to hold the fort until the younger generation who refuse to eat sea turtles because they haven't grown up eating it, until they come to the fore. And they understand issues, these new issues like these startups. They understand it much better than we do. And so social media is important for them. Social media is important for communities, indigenous peoples who are shut out of the official discussions in their country. You can say you're not coming to the town hall meeting, I don't want you here, and we'll have cops and riot police, but you can't stay unless the government stops the internet and shuts down the internet. You can't stop them from speaking out. Anyone, anywhere can speak out and choose his or her or their preferred media that they want to go to. I think that's the value of social media. Of course, in some countries, they clamp down on social media. You can't have a perfect world. But I think, for example, I'll never forget, this is an anecdote, a very interesting anecdote. Whilst I was in New York, I was an ambassador for 13 years there. One day I was in Seychelles and I was attending a function, an ex-cabinet minister by the president. And as I was walking around, one of the presidential bodyguards came up to me and said, "Hi, Ambassador Jumeau." He was a young guy. "Hi, Ambassador." I said, "Hi, how are you?" And he says, "I just wanted to tell you, I follow you." This is the bodyguard of a president. Otherwise, if he didn't on social media, he wouldn't be interested at all. Now, he's not going to whisper in the ear of the president to say, protect this and let's do that. But it hit me that you don't know who's listening out there. You don't know who maybe you've written off. And the best way for them to communicate is with the phone.
So for you, the benefits still outweigh the growing challenges.
Oh, yes. Of course, now we have to do all the challenges of AI coming in and that sort of thing. But in countries, in developing countries especially, sometimes the only way in the heart of Africa or Asia for people to be able to connect the authorities or doctors or nurses or lifesavers or rescuers is through social media.
Maybe I can just finish on one point I ask everyone who's been working in this field a long time. How do you stay motivated for so long? I mean, you've seen, you know, so many things tried and not happening as fast as you wanted to. How do you, where do you keep motivation coming from, that scarce, rare, important resource?
You know, I'll say something that I say around the world. You know, there's a lot of definitions of resilience, right? Resilience is the smile on the face of an islander. We go through so much. When Fiji was hit by a cyclone once, and obviously it's on all the media, and they showed the children in the ruins. The first day they were all gloomy, they were trying to, it's still wet. By the third day, you started seeing the smile come out. We can't afford to be depressed. We can't afford to give up. Each time I go to a beach, I see something, I get upset or I get angry. I don't become complacent. I never say, oh, what am I going to do? I say, no way I'm going to allow this. I am not going to migrate, become a climate refugee. I don't like the term, but climate migrant or whatever. I am not. I can't afford it. I'm a grandfather. I have two new grandchildren. One day, my granddaughters will ask me, I hear you had these titles, but look at the mess we're in. What did you do? I have to be able to answer that question. So I don't do speeches like, every world leader speech. We have to do this for our children and our grandchildren. And then they go home and do things as if they don't have children and grandchildren. So by making it personal, between a pact between me and my granddaughters, if I save the world for my granddaughter, I save it for everybody else.
Well, on that note, Ronny Jumeau, thank you so
Thank you
much for
very
being such a great guest on C2GTalk.
Thank you for having me, and it's been a pleasure. Thank you.